Few biblical stories have generated as much intrigue and bewilderment as that of Cain and Abel, recounted in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. Its brevity contrasts with the symbolic magnitude it has acquired over the centuries. In just 24 verses, we are presented with the first human birth, the first act of worship, the first murder, the first divine judgment, and the first mark of spiritual protection, all framed within a simple, almost schematic narrative that leaves more questions than answers. Why did Cain kill Abel? What exactly caused Yahweh to reject his offering? What is the meaning of the advice God gives before the crime? What does the mark that protects him represent? How do we explain the sudden transition from the offering to the murder? These questions have no direct answers in the text. The attentive reader soon notices there is an ellipsis, a narrative void where the cause of the conflict should be. We are told Cain presented an offering, that Yahweh did not accept it, that Cain became enraged and his countenance fell, and suddenly he is killing his brother in the field. There is no mention of how, with what, or what conversation, if any, took place. Only, and Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. This omission has historically served as an invitation to interpretation. What is not said opens the space for generations of theologians, philosophers, exegetes, psychologists, and writers to try to fill the gap with meaning. Thus, multiple versions of the why have emerged. Envy, lack of faith, anger, inner corruption, injustice, social conflict, and even a clash between civilizations. Each era has seen in Cain's face a reflection of its own questions. But this story stands out not only for its silences, but for its narrative economy. There is no detailed introduction of the characters, no description of their personalities. We are not told whether they were close, whether they competed, or if they lived harmoniously. We only know the essentials, that Cain was the firstborn, a farmer, and offered Yahweh the fruits of the earth, that Abel was a shepherd and offered the best of his flock. The text merely presents the facts with an almost surgical coldness, without adjectives, without prior judgment, without emotional buildup. This literary sobriety is not accidental. In the context of the Hebrew Bible, where many stories include long introductions, genealogies, extensive dialogues, and dramatic development, the story of Cain and Abel stands out for its silence. It is as if the text resists explaining itself, as if, instead of telling us what to think, it deliberately pushes us to meditate. Is this, then, a historical narrative, a moral fable, a theological allegory, or a symbol of deeper tensions? This essay will attempt to explore those possibilities based on a key premise: that the story of Cain and Abel should not be approached solely through modern emotion or intuition, but through its original literary, religious, and anthropological context. As we go forward, we will move beyond the more superficial interpretations, such as simple envy, and delve into what the text might truly be trying to communicate to its original audience: a people in formation, of semi-nomadic origin, facing older civilizations and seeking meaning amid conflict. Because understanding why Cain killed Abel is not merely about solving an ancient crime. It also means understanding the soul of the biblical text, its purpose as a spiritual document, and its message to those of us who still search for meaning in the chaos of humanity. One of the most disconcerting aspects of the Cain and Abel story is that, despite being one of the most consequential events in biblical history, the first murder, the first moral judgment between humans, the first direct divine punishment upon a human life, the text is extraordinarily sparse in detail. Genesis 4 does not explain, elaborate, or justify. It simply narrates with short phrases and prolonged silences. And these silences are not accidental. They are cracks through which fundamental questions emerge, questions the reader or believer must ask for themselves. Like a cryptic parable, the text leaves interpretation to breathe in the absence of explanations. Why did Yahweh not accept Cain's offering? The text states that both brothers presented a sacrifice: Cain as a farmer, from the fruits of the earth; Abel as a shepherd, from the firstborn of his sheep. Yahweh looked favorably upon Abel's offering, but did not look with favor upon Cain's. The reason? None is given. There is no mention of any prior condition or requirement for the sacrifice. The text doesn't say Cain's offering was of poor quality. nor that God had specifically requested animals over produce. It doesn't even suggest Abel was more devout. In fact, the narrative omits any explicit judgment on the intentions of either brother. It simply says that Cain became upset, and his face fell when his offering was rejected. This silence has been the source of endless speculation. But rather than trying to guess what Yahweh wanted or what Cain did wrong, it may be more fruitful to ask a deeper question. Why doesn't the text say, "Why leave the rejection without justification?" Is the goal not explanation but to show the effect of rejection on the human spirit? What does Yahweh's advice mean? Right after the rejection, Yahweh addresses Cain with an enigmatic phrase. "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it." Genesis 4:6-7. This passage has been the subject of multiple translations and exegetical debates. What is this sin at the door? A metaphor? A warning? A personification of evil? Some rabbis interpret it as carnal desire or ego, waiting for an opportunity to take hold of man. Others see it as a poetic way of saying Cain is on the verge of error, but still has the power to overcome it. Curiously, this warning, whatever it means, seems to have no effect. Cain doesn't respond, doesn't reflect, doesn't justify himself. The narrative abruptly jumps to the murder. Genesis 4:8 is one of the most terse and powerful phrases in the Old Testament. "And it came to pass, while they were in the field, that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him." That's it. No dialogue, no description of a weapon, the place, or the impulse. Nothing to help us understand how a divine conversation became a fratricide. This abrupt leap, this narrative ellipsis, suggests the absence of a fragment, or at least the omission of a logically expected development. Many scholars have pointed out that a line is likely missing from the original text, lost during transmission or redaction of the Masoretic manuscript. In fact, some modern translations attempt to smooth out the transition by adding a phrase. For example, certain versions include, "And Cain said to his brother Abel, 'Let us go out to the field.'" But that line does not appear in the original Hebrew. It is an explanatory interpolation without textual basis. This reinforces the idea that the text is not meant to tell a complete story, but rather to present a symbolic structure in which the murder becomes an inevitable consequence of unresolved conflict in the human heart, more than a crime driven by specific motives. After the murder, Yahweh curses Cain. He condemns him to be a wanderer and a fugitive on the earth. But when Cain complains that anyone who finds him might kill him, God responds with a disconcerting gesture. "And Yahweh set a mark upon Cain, so that anyone who found him would not kill him." Genesis 4:15. This combination of punishment and protection has puzzled interpreters since antiquity. Why protect the one who committed the first murder? Isn't this a contradiction of divine justice? Or is Cain's punishment not death but exile and rootlessness, a deeper form of judgment? In any case, the narrative doesn't resolve the dilemma. The mark of Cain remains one of the most potent and ambivalent symbols in all of Judeo-Christian tradition. It simultaneously represents guilt and mercy, exclusion and belonging, punishment and selection. As we've seen, the story of Cain and Abel is terse, fragmented, and full of silences. However, after the murder and divine judgment, the text takes a surprising turn. Suddenly we move from the primordial human drama to the emergence of a surprisingly detailed genealogy describing Cain's descendants, their names, and their occupations. In a narrative where the motive for the crime is left unexplained and characters are barely sketched, why does the text stop to detail professions, cities, and artifacts? Cain's progeny. After his sentence, Cain knew his wife and had a son named Enoch, a name also found in Seth's lineage, creating a confusing echo between the offspring of the cursed and the righteous. Cain then built a city and named it Enoch as well. Another striking detail: how can a wanderer found a city? The punishment was to be rootless and homeless, yet Cain establishes an urban center, which seems to violate or contradict the divine judgment. This act is not punished, not even commented on. It's simply recorded. The reader is left perplexed. From there, we are presented with a genealogical line that culminates in an especially enigmatic character, Lamech. We are told he had two wives, Ada and Zillah, and that his sons became pioneers in highly symbolic professions. Jabal, father of those who dwell in tents and herd livestock. Jubal, father of all who play the harp and flute. Tubal-Cain, forger of tools made from bronze and iron. And a daughter, Naamah, who receives no role or symbol, but whose name is remembered. This level of detail is especially striking. Up to this point in Genesis, very few names have been mentioned. Abel himself dies without descendants, without any description of his character or legacy. Yet Cain's lineage, the condemned murderers, extends with names, professions, and cultural references. Why this focus on professions? The professions of Cain's descendants are highly symbolic. Jabal represents pastoral nomads. Jubal, music. Tubal-Cain, technological and metallurgical development. These characters do nothing to advance the plot, do not interact with God or other characters, and are not protagonists of theological events. So what function do they serve? The most plausible answer is that their inclusion is not narrative, but ideological. Cain's genealogy seems to present a coded social critique or commentary aimed at the text's original listeners or readers. The fact that all these occupations are linked to the lineage of the murderer suggests an ambivalent or negative stance toward these human activities. Music, organized nomadic herding, and especially metallurgy, the mastery of fire, the forging of tools, and eventually weapons, appear here as cultural products tied to the cursed line. This connection has led many interpreters to see the text as drawing a distinction between the simple, tribal, pastoral life of the early Israelites and the more developed urban lifestyles of other Canaanite or Mesopotamian civilizations. In other words, what one culture may see as progress and civilization, another may interpret as corruption, artifice, and spiritual danger. The text concludes this genealogy with an enigmatic poem spoken by Lamech. I have killed a man for wounding me, and a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. This poem, known as the Song of the Sword, has puzzled readers and exegetes for centuries. Whom did Lamech kill? Is he confessing to a murder? Is he boasting about his violence? Or merely invoking the divine protection inherited from his ancestor? There are many interpretations, but one thing is clear. Lamech compares himself to Cain and multiplies the measure of either punishment or protection. This gesture can be read as arrogance, defiance, or a symbol of a society that has internalized violence as a means of personal affirmation. The fact that this poem appears at the end of Cain's genealogy reinforces the idea that the urban, technologically advanced culture of his descendants has completely distorted the sense of justice and reverence for God. If Cain was punished but protected, Lamech boasts of his violence without any sign of guilt, turning transgression into an inherited right. To understand the story of Cain and Abel beyond its immediate emotional impact, it's essential to examine how it is written. It's not just about what the text says, but how it says it. The extreme brevity of the passage, its apparent disconnection from the preceding and following narratives, the absence of character development or recognizable psychological depth, all reveal something important. This is not a classical narrative, but a symbolic piece, shaped like a fable or archetypal tale. The skeletal structure of the text. Genesis 4 can be divided into 3 main movements: the birth of Cain and Abel, and the offerings each presents; the divine rejection, Yahweh's counsel, and the murder; the curse, the mark of protection, and Cain's genealogy. Each of these sections is narrated with extreme economy. The characters have no background, no explicit motivations, no internal development. They simply act without prior introduction, as in parables or exemplary stories. We don't know how Cain and Abel were as people, how they related to one another, or whether they competed. The text gives us only what is necessary for the reader to focus on the symbolic message, not the details. This type of narrative construction is common in ancient wisdom literature, where the goal is not to tell a story rich in human nuance, but to transmit a universal teaching, a moral, a spiritual principle. Like Jesus' parables in the Gospels, this story is deliberately abstract, allowing the message to transcend cultures, eras, and levels of understanding. The disconnection from the previous narrative. Another clue confirming its symbolic nature is the disconnection between Genesis 4 and chapter 3. In the previous chapter, the focus was on the fall of Adam and Eve, the serpent, the forbidden fruit, the loss of Eden. In that account, God appears with the compound name Yahweh Elohim, in Hebrew, Yivah Elohim, combining the two most important names of the divine. But in the Cain and Abel narrative, only Yahweh appears. The name Elohim disappears completely. This change in nomenclature is not trivial. Many scholars interpret it as a sign of a shift in source or doctrinal focus, likely linked to distinct traditions that were later woven together in the final redaction of Genesis. In other words, the Cain and Abel story is not a direct continuation of Eden's narrative, even though it follows it immediately. It is a self-contained literary unit with a specific intention, different from that of the serpent and the fall. Yahweh as the central protagonist. An additional element reinforcing the doctrinal character of the story is the exclusive protagonism of Yahweh. His name appears at least 9 times in the passage, not as a distant figure but as a central actor in the events. He receives the offerings, speaks with Cain, pronounces judgment, imposes punishment, and provides protection. This intense divine involvement suggests the story is deeply connected to Yahwist worship, the doctrinal heart of the Hebrew priesthood that organized and preserved much of the Old Testament. In this sense, the passage is not so much about describing concrete events as about delivering a theological message, a warning, a teaching about what Yahweh expects and rejects from those who approach him. Absence of psychology, abundance of symbolism. While other parts of Genesis develop characters with more depth, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, even Noah have dialogues, complex decisions, personal crises. Here the figures are almost archetypes: the rejected firstborn, the innocent accepted one, the guilty murderer, the merciful judge. This lack of psychological detail is not a narrative flaw, but a deliberate decision. Like a fable, the characters represent ideas, attitudes, spiritual principles. Cain is not just a man. He is the figure of faithless worship, of wounded pride, of resentment leading to violence. Abel is not merely a victim. He embodies pure and sincere worship, which, precisely because it is genuine, becomes a target for hostility. Thus, the story functions as a microcosm of a central tension in biblical spirituality: the difference between those who approach God out of routine and those who do so with total surrender, between formal religion and true faith, and perhaps also between two ways of life: the settled, self-sufficient urban culture and the dependent, humble, nomadic existence. Traditional interpretation, jealousy, and envy. Since ancient times, the most widespread interpretation of Abel's murder by Cain has centered on jealousy and envy. Deeply rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition, this reading claims Cain, seeing God favor Abel's offering, felt wounded in his pride and reacted with hatred, committing the first fratricide in human history. From this view, the story serves as a moral warning. Negative emotions, if not controlled, inevitably lead to destruction. This reading has been especially popular in Christian preaching, where Cain becomes the symbol of corrupt human nature, the need to master passions, and the ideal of a sincere relationship with God based on humility and devotion. Envy is presented as the first social sin after the fall, a sign of how evil manifests in human relationships from the beginning. The text does not mention envy. The first and most obvious problem, Genesis 4 never mentions envy or jealousy. It says Cain was very angry and his face fell, Genesis 4:5. These expressions are emotionally interpreted as frustration, sorrow, or resentment, but envy is not explicitly stated. Analysis of key terms. The verb translated as was very angry comes from the Hebrew hara, jarah, meaning literally to burn or to kindle, and by extension, to be very angry. It does not imply jealousy, but rather a violent emotional reaction, typically anger. Meanwhile, his face fell is translated from the Hebrew vayiplav panav, vayipalu panav, literally, his face fell. In biblical language, this expression usually indicates sadness, humiliation, or dejection. Together, these suggest Cain is deeply affected, but not necessarily envious. It could be pain, self-frustration, or confusion in the face of divine rejection. In short, envy is an inference, not a textual fact. Envy versus anger, similar outcomes, distinct roots. Although envy and anger may appear similar in their effects, both can lead to violence. Their emotional roots differ. Envy implies a desire for what another has, a dissatisfaction with oneself projected onto another's success. Anger, however, is a response to perceived injustice or humiliation. Cain doesn't seem to desire what Abel has. He seems wounded by the rejection of his own offering. What consumes him is not Abel's success, but his own failure before God. This subtle difference is crucial for understanding the symbolic depth of the story. The constructed reading of envy. Despite this, many translations and sermons have artificially inserted the idea of envy. Some Bible versions even add lines like, "And Cain said to Abel, 'Let us go to the field,' a phrase not found in the Masoretic Hebrew text, to psychologically prepare the reader for a premeditated, jealousy-motivated act. But these interpolations reflect a desire to fill the narrative gap rather than fidelity to the original text. Moreover, if the central message were a warning against envy, why not make it explicit? The Bible names emotions clearly in other passages. If it doesn't do so here, it likely means that is not the focus. Can all this truly stem from mere jealousy? Another issue with the envy interpretation is its narrative disproportion. This is the first murder in human history, a dramatic rupture of brotherhood. Could it really all stem from one poorly managed emotion? If the author intended a symbolic warning about envy, why use such an extreme scenario and not name the emotion clearly? This suggests that perhaps the envy reading is insufficient for the text's symbolic complexity. Doctrinal interpretation, offering without faith. Another long-standing explanation, especially within Christian tradition and systematic theology, posits that the conflict's root lies not in the type of offering, but in the spiritual quality of the giver. According to this view, Cain was not rejected for what he offered, but for how he offered it. In other words, Cain presented an offering without faith. His act was external, formal, perhaps routine, while Abel's sacrifice was made with sincerity, devotion, and trust. This reading turns the passage into a lesson on spiritual authenticity. God values not the form, but the heart's intent. It becomes a critique of empty religiosity, ritual observance without real connection to the Creator. This view is deeply rooted in New Testament texts, especially Hebrews 11:4. By faith Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous. And also in 1 John 3:12, not as Cain, who was of the evil one and killed his brother. And why did he kill him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Problems with this interpretation in Genesis 4. Despite its doctrinal coherence, this reading finds little support in Genesis 4 itself. The original narrative doesn't suggest Cain lacked faith or sincerity. The Hebrew text simply states, "In the course of time, Cain brought to Yahweh an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and of their fat portions. And Yahweh had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard." Genesis 4:3-5. Key observations. Both brothers offered what they had. Cain, a farmer, gave fruit. Abel, a shepherd, gave animals. There is no explicit criticism of Cain's gift. There's no mention of internal attitude, no judgment of sincerity, pride, or faith for either. The only extra detail about Abel's offering is that it came from the firstborn and the fat portions, interpreted as generosity or devotion. But no prior command suggests this was expected. Nothing in the text directly states that Cain was rejected due to a lack of faith. That interpretation comes from later texts written in different contexts, with theological aims that may not reflect Genesis's original meaning. The hermeneutical challenge. From a literary and hermeneutical perspective, this raises an important question. Can we use later interpretations to explain earlier texts? In Christian tradition, the answer has typically been yes. The New Testament is seen as illuminating the Old. But from a stricter academic perspective, this is problematic. Each text should be interpreted in its own context, with its own language, audience, and intent. Seen this way, the offering without faith explanation cannot be the primary reading of Genesis 4. It overlays a later theology onto a much older and distinct text. Risk of simplistic moralism. Another issue with this view is that it can reduce a profoundly symbolic narrative into a simplistic religious moral. God loves sincere worship and rejects empty ritual. While spiritually valid, this can obscure richer dimensions of the text. It also raises troubling questions. Why doesn't God clearly explain his expectations? Why does he reject Cain without prior warning? Why does Yahweh's counsel come after the rejection? These narrative inconsistencies aren't resolved by the idea of inner faith. Instead, they suggest the text is designed to provoke deep reflection, not provide easy answers. Why has this view prevailed? The faith versus ritual interpretation became dominant because it fits perfectly with early Christian theology. Salvation comes not by works, but by faith. This doctrine, central to Paul and the Epistle to the Hebrews, needed Old Testament examples to reinforce it. Abel, the righteous one, became a model of authentic faith. Cain, a symbol of superficial, corrupted religion. This view is valid within Christian doctrinal frameworks. But, as we've seen, it does not arise organically from Genesis. It results from its theological reinterpretation in a different context.